In the early 1800s, black male slaves were sexually abused by their white masters in the pre-Civil War South. Resisting an enslaver's sexual advances could result in severe punishment and even death for an enslaved person. The consequences of resistance came from 19th century published narratives, as well as the 20th century interviews of former slaves compiled in the 1930s by the Works Progress Administration's Slave Narrative Project. Neither laws nor societal attitudes protected slaves from being sexually abused by their masters. In slaveholding states, slaves were the property of their owners, and owners could do with their slaves as they pleased. An enslaver could not be charged with a crime. Slaves were merely livestock, not persons with recognizable rights. Male and female slaves were kept, bought, and sold on the basis of their physical attributes. A field laborer was fit and muscular. Male and female slaves were sexualized and valued on their ability to reproduce. A male slave was called a buck or stud and was usually well endowed. He was expected to impregnate as many female slaves as possible. A female slave was called a breeder or breeding stock and was usually well endowed. Starting at age 13, she was expected to give birth to 4 or 5 children. By age 20, most plantation slaves were teenagers, on average 17 years old, and their average life expectancy was only 21 years of age. Generally, plantation owners engaged in the selective breeding of slaves with the goal of producing as many slave children as possible. Typically, plantation owners wanted male field laborers who could be put to work on the plantation or sold to other plantations for a profit. As Thomas Jefferson described it, female slaves, as opposed to male slaves, produce capital. In 1820, Jefferson stated the following: "I consider a woman who brings a child every 2 years as more profitable than the best man of the farm. What she produces is an addition to the capital, while his labors disappear in mere consumption." In 1792, in a letter to President George Washington, Jefferson said he was making a 4% profit every year on the birth of black children. Male slaves were sexually assaulted by their white masters, both male and female. It was a common practice throughout the South for male slaves to be denied pants. Instead, male slaves were issued shirts which left their private parts exposed. Male slaves who impregnated many female slaves were typically rewarded with special privileges. Some plantation owners hired out well-endowed male slaves to other plantations for the sole purpose of impregnating female slaves. These male slaves for hire were referred to as stockmen. A stockman was placed in a room with several female slaves and was expected to impregnate as many as possible. Plantation owners coveted slaves who were fit and well endowed. Slavery was not merely about forced labor. It was about domination, control, and the assertion of power over the enslaved. Historian Thomas A. Foster wrote in Rethinking Rufus, "Sexual violations of enslaved men, that sexual assault of enslaved men occurred systematically and in a wide variety of forms, including physical assault, sexual coercion, and other intimate violations." White women of the planter class were known to sexually abuse male slaves. White women of the planter class were generally the wives or widows of wealthy plantation owners. White women from the planter class lived privileged but restricted lives. Like other women of that period, women of the planter class could not vote or hold office. Upon getting married, their property became their husband's property, and he was free to do with this property as he pleased. In the South, women generally got married as teenagers, around 15, to older men. They generally lacked a formal education, and they could die at a young age from childbirth. Plantation mistresses were considered their husband's property. Husbands were allowed to abuse their wives in order to control them. These women were not allowed to travel on their own. When they did travel, it was with an older male chaperone. For women, extramarital affairs were considered scandalous. It was even more scandalous if a married woman gave birth to a child as a result of an extramarital affair. Planters' wives were expected to be virtuous. Their primary duty was to manage the household and attend to their children. However, historian Elizabeth Fox Genovese said that white women, like their husbands, engaged in extramarital affairs, just not as frequently. Men from the planter class were wealthy plantation owners. They could vote and hold office. Owning a plantation gave them social status. They were influential in establishing laws that governed slaveholding. Their wives were considered their property. They could travel as they pleased. Men frequently left their wives alone on the plantation due to business, pleasure, or military service. And they had affairs with their female slaves, as evidenced by the presence of mixed-race children on plantations. These affairs created bitterness within many planter-class marriages. According to Harriet Jacobs, who wrote Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl in 1867, everyone on a plantation knew which children were fathered by the master. Only the master's wife pretended not to know that her husband had fathered mixed-race children with his female slaves. As Jacobs points out, the children who were created from these affairs were often sold to another owner in order to protect the honor and dignity of the master's wife, or she would be forced to face the fact that her husband was having affairs with his slaves. Being a woman of the planter class could be a lonely and sad existence. However, women of the planter class could exert their authority over their slaves. Plantation mistresses supervised the domestic slaves who handled the daily housekeeping duties, such as cleaning, washing, ironing, cooking, and baking. Plantation wives were second in command on plantations behind their husbands. They were directly in charge of all of the female slaves, including those who worked in the plantation house and those who worked in the fields. Plantation mistresses were powerful. Like their husbands, plantation mistresses could use their power to abuse slaves. Like their husbands, plantation mistresses had affairs with slaves. Their husbands, who were plantation owners, attended to the business of running their plantations. Plantation owners hired overseers who interacted directly with the field laborers. Overseers employed whips and other forms of punishment to discipline slaves and drive more production. When husbands were away from their plantations, their wives took charge of the day-to-day operations of their plantations, including issuing directions to the overseers. Wives could issue commands, give instructions, and punish slaves within their homes and on their plantations. In her book, They Were Her Property, White Women as Slave Owners in the American South, Stephanie Jones Rogers, UC Berkeley Associate Professor of History, states that white women actively managed enslaved people. According to Jones Rogers, white females were taught as children, by their slave-owning parents, how to manage slaves. Some women were given their own personal slaves as children, and they were given additional slaves as they grew older. They observed slaves being punished, and they were allowed to punish slaves themselves. According to Jones Rogers, it is estimated that women made up 40% of the total number of slave owners in America. White women forced male slaves into having sexual affairs. Captain Richard J. Hinton, an abolitionist commander in the Civil War, documented the stories of black male slaves who had been compelled into sexual relationships with their mistresses. According to Hinton, I have never found a bright-looking colored man, whose confidences I have won, who has not told me of instances where he has been compelled, either by his mistress, or by white women of the same class, to have connections with them. One male slave was ordered to sleep with his mistress after her husband died. The laws made sexual assault by a slave against a white woman a crime that could result in severe punishment, which included death. Black men were thought to be inherently lustful. A white woman could coerce a black man into having an affair with her by threatening to falsely accuse him of sexual assault. Furthermore, a slave who resisted his owner's sexual advances could be severely punished by his owner. According to Harriet Jacobs, the daughters of plantation owners could coerce black men into having affairs with them. Daughters knew that their fathers were having affairs with their female slaves. As a form of rebellion against their fathers, daughters sought affairs with their father's male slaves. Jacobs wrote, I have myself seen the master of such a household whose head was bowed down in shame, for it was known in the neighborhood that his daughter had selected one of the meanest slaves on his plantation to be the father of his first grandchild. She did not make her advances to her equals, nor even to her father's more intelligent servants. She selected the most brutalized, over whom her authority could be exercised with less fear of exposure. If a white woman gave birth to a mixed-race child, the child could be sold into slavery. Infanticide was also a common practice. Plantation mistresses who were subordinate to their husbands exerted their authority over their slaves. Black male slaves were also sexually abused by white men. In 2011, historian Thomas A. Foster wrote in an article, "The Sexual Abuse of Black Men Under Slavery," that historically, the sexual assault of men is well known. The scholarship on early America shows us numerous instances of sexual assault of men. White men routinely inflicted sexual abuse on male slaves. In Harriet Jacobs' narrative, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, she recounts an incident where a young man named Luke was chained to his master's bed, wearing only a shirt, and was compelled to satisfy his master's sexual desires. The sexual exploitation of black male slaves is a painful and often overlooked dimension of the history of slavery in America. If you found this content valuable, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel to stay connected for more in-depth explorations of history's hidden stories.